Okay, so today, Dr. Kevin Kumashiro joins us. I really encourage you to check out his website. And as you know, if you've been coming week after week, I always start with a quote. And I thought that this one was particularly fitting. A hallmark for me of a culturally relevant teacher is someone who understands that we're operating in a fundamentally inequitable system. They take that as a given, and that the teacher's role is not merely to help kids fit into an unfair system, but rather to give them the skills, the knowledge, and the dispositions to change the inequity. The idea is not to get more people at the top of an unfair pyramid. The idea is to say the pyramid is the wrong structure. And that's Gloria Ladson-Billings, another scholar whose work has really influenced me in my career. And I think she's someone whose work you should check out if you are unfamiliar with her. So I always begin talking about why inclusivity matters. And I think that part of what I've talked about in previous weeks, particularly in the last couple of weeks, is that while education cannot save us from racism, it can help to disrupt systems and processes which perpetuate injustice and inequity, and then help us to embrace diversity, individuality, and strengths. And a lot of people ideologically ask, you know, if you have this ideology, if you embrace inclusivity, how do you put it into action? And I think that one of those ways is anti-oppressive education, which is the work of Dr. Kumashiro. So I shared this last week, and those of you, have heard me talk about Dr. Kumashiro's work previously. What is anti-oppressive education? It's traditional and common sense ways of engaging in education which contribute to oppression and schools and society. So it's responding to those. And it suggests that common sense approaches to education can reform, mask, or exacerbate oppressive education methods. And so it unpacks what educators can do. And what that looks like is a deep commitment to changing how educators conceptualize and engage in curriculum pedagogy and classroom management and school culture. And this is from Dr. Kumashiro's work directly. It transforms institutional policies and structure and and it relies on exploring perspectives on education that do not conform. So inclusive education is sometimes understood by people as a faction of special education, but it's much more than that. And as I've talked about it during these webinars, we're talking about race, class, gender identity, language, ability, all of the differences that make up our societies that we need to be talking about and addressing in schools. Most importantly, anti-oppressive education expects discomfort. And I think that that is one of the greatest pieces of information that I've taken from Dr. Kumashiro's work, and something that I work to realize every day in my own work, that this idea of learning in crisis, and that discomfort pushes our thinking forward, and really that we can't be learning until we identify what it is that is keeping us back from realizing a new understanding. So I want to talk just for one more minute about the times today, because I believe that it's critically important that as educators, we are embracing ways that we can help promote change in our schools. And I'm here borrowing language from Tarana Burke, who is widely credited for this phrase from the Me Too movement. This is a movement, not a moment. And I believe that's true of education and race, and developing anti-racist ideas can be better realized as a result of some of the tragedies that have occurred over time as a result of police brutality and other things. So a lot of what happens during a moment and a movement is that we can help to shift beliefs through education to a place where it can be realized. So it can be enacted versus just thought about. So lots of teachers ask me, what can I do about this? Sometimes it feels too big. And I think it's really important to be thinking about this in terms of teacher preparation, and how teacher educators are preparing teachers. We need teachers to have an answer to that question as they're moving out into the field. And we need those really committed educators in the field right now to be able to answer that question too. So I think sharing resources in the ways that we've done in previous weeks via these webinars and the ways that you've been sharing resources with one another is a critically important way to move the needle forward on that. And if we can answer the question, what can I do? It will start to shift our ideas in schools to be more inclusive ideologically and more inclusive spaces actionably. So the question that I ask myself is, what if teachers were prepared to think inclusively, and then they went out and they enacted that in their teaching? And I believe that it can contribute to, disrupting the perpetuation of oppressive structures and really contribute to meaningful change. And it may be small steps, but it's the collective small steps that add up to a movement and not a moment. So I am going to stop sharing my screen now. And in a moment, I am going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Kumashiro. So I am going to unmute you, Kevin. This, again, struggling with the technology. Here we go. Okay. And I would like to say a few words about Kevin Kumashiro. So I'm very grateful today to be joined by Dr. Kevin Kumashiro. He is an internationally renowned education expert. He's the author of several award-winning books, including 6 Lenses for Oppressive Education, Bad Teacher, The Seduction of Common Sense, and Teaching Toward Democracy, just to name a few. He's the founding director of the Center for Anti-Oppressive Education and a founding member of Education Deans for Justice and Equity. And truly, he has a list of accolades that are so long, I could spend the entire hour telling you about them. So instead of that, I really encourage you to visit his website, kevinkumashiro.com, and check out his work and opportunities to learn from him, which I have done very recently. Many of you who have come week after week know that I frequently reference Kevin's work because it's had a great impact on me and my own work. And I think that that's probably visible in the way that I've built the identity of the Stonehill College Graduate Education Program. And I read Kevin's paper, which I talked about last week, Toward a Theory of Anti-Oppressive Education, can't see it here, over 10 years ago. And it is one of the papers that I frequently return to, along with his other work, some of his books I reference almost on a weekly basis to help me really make sense about things. And I think that when I was thinking about what to share about Kevin Kumashiro and how important his work is, I think one of the defining factors of his work is that it's so accessible, and it really truly helps me to make sense of things in ways that move my thinking and my own work forward in an actionable way. So I've been learning from Dr. Kumashiro for over 10 years. I'm grateful today to call him both a friend and a colleague. And I still learn from him. So I participated just recently in January in one of his leadership workshops. And I hope to be able to do that again in the future and be together. But in the meantime, I've been able to participate in some of his webinars as well. So I'm very grateful for the ways that he offers educators opportunities to continue to learn and advance their own thinking, and not only to be educators who are working to enact anti-oppressive education, but also to be activists themselves and raise their voices in policy and really important conversations. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Kevin Kumashiro. And if you would like to see him, and you just click speaker view in the upper right-hand corner, he'll appear in your screen. So thank you so much, Kevin.
What an amazing introduction. Thank you so much, Elizabeth Stringer Keefe. It was just such a pleasure and an honor to be able to join you in this really important webinar series. Just a little shout out right back to Professor Keefe, who wrote one of the most brilliant books I've ever read, Reclaiming Accountability. Those of you interested in teacher education, I sure hope you will check that out. But I know many of you who study with her or have been on these webinars are learning so much. And so I so value and appreciate your work. Thank you so much. And thanks also to MCEC for co-hosting. It's with a lot of joy that I see so many joining us, either on Zoom or on YouTube. And it's also with a lot of grief that we gather in a moment in the midst of such crises. And so let's begin with two acknowledgements. One acknowledgement is that many Black lives are being ended, murdered by the state or by others with no state justice. And the second acknowledgement is that the coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated inequities and accelerated trauma, not only around unemployment, homelessness, food insecurity, but also around mental health, depression, anxiety, and so on, right? The list goes on and on. So I just wanted to begin the webinar by kind of naming these two aspects of the moment. I'm actually going to talk a lot more about what I see as the role of education in responding to these aspects. But if I can invite you all to join me in just taking a few deep breaths or a moment of silence as we honor these realities. So thank you. Let me talk about three things today. One is the role of education in solidarity with Black lives. The second is what is happening in education in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. And then the third is what is anti-oppressive education in this moment, which fortunately I don't have to say too much about because Professor Keefe did such an awesome job summarizing anti-oppressive education. I was like, oh, I don't need to do my webinar. This is so great. All right, let's talk a little bit about education in solidarity with Black lives. And I wanted to begin with this because I'm so troubled by the rhetoric we hear or that we heard and continue to hear about uprisings over the last couple of weeks. Particularly as we saw devastation to property, shops, and things like that, we heard rhetoric of good actors and bad actors. Good actors are those who protested peacefully and law-abidingly, and bad actors were thugs engaging in looting, who were causing all sorts of damage, who weren't part of the kind of official protests, right? And this kind of very simplistic either or rhetoric was coming from all sorts of voices. It was coming from Trump, but it was also coming from Biden, and it was coming from the media, and it was coming from a whole bunch of educational leaders as well. So I want to kind of push back on this framing of this narrative that we're hearing. So I'm reminded of when I was a preschool teacher back in, I don't know, almost 30 years ago. I once had this wonderfully rascal student, and he was getting in trouble all the time. And one time we were outdoors playing, I don't know if it was recess or what, and he was doing something that he should not have been doing. And for some reason, I just, at that point, lost my patience and lost my temper. I started yelling. I was like, oh my gosh, I'm yelling. I think we need a timeout. So I gave us all a timeout so I could calm down. And at the end of the day, as I'm leaving the school, I ran into one of my colleagues whose classroom was closest to the playground. And she says to me, oh, it sounded like you had kind of a rough day today. And I'm like, well, no, I mean, I'm like, yeah, it was a very rough day for me. And she said, you know, when students are acting out, I like to ask myself, what is it that they're trying to tell me? What is it that their actions are trying to tell me that they either were unable to tell me in typical kind of school types of communications, school modes of communications, or maybe that they have been trying to tell me over and over again, but I just haven't been able to hear. And this reminds me of research from really half a century ago in education that showed us how a lot of historically marginalized populations are acting out in schools. And they're not acting out because they're bad students. They're not acting out because they don't have the capacity to learn. They're acting out oftentimes because, whether subconsciously or not, they're aware, whether consciously or subconsciously, they're aware on some level that schools don't work for them, right? That acting out is a way of communicating their resistance, their pushback. In fact, we can think about even in a different sphere within like foreign affairs. The CIA uses this term blowback when they're talking about all the destruction and trauma that is caused by the United States around the world that the general public doesn't see. So when people around the world start to push back, we don't understand the context and how we caused that pushback. And so we start to call them terrorists, we start to call them evil, we start to call them anti-democratic, when actually what they're doing is called blowback. It's actually a force that's coming where they're trying to insist that we need to hear and see and grapple with the destruction that we are responsible for causing. Right? Martin Luther King, in one of his final speeches, he talks about how a riot is the language of the unheard. And I love that phrasing because the indictment in his words is not on those who are acting. It's actually on the state that has refused to hear those that they've so disenfranchised. Cornel West calls this moment a moment of reckoning. And we need to ask, are we reckoning, right, with not just the uprisings, but what the uprisings are trying to speak to and push back on? This makes me think of at least three kind of issues to grapple with. One is, how are we understanding the problem, right? Or actually, are we understanding the problem systemically? Second thing is, are we understanding the problem intersectionally? And the third then is, where does education come in? So understanding the problem systemically, you know, when we think about police murders of Black men like George Floyd, of Black women like Breonna Taylor, of Black trans people like Tony McDade, when we think about police actions that maybe don't lead to death but are ensconced in violence, such as the highly kind of visible in the media attacks on children, right? Being tackled, being thrown to the ground, being handcuffed, or even some of you may have seen this image that went viral of police macing a 9-year-old Black child in the midst of peaceful protest, right? There's state action, but there's also state inaction, right? Like of lynching of men like Ahmaud Arbery, where it took a long time, right, before the state would act, and it only acted when it came to kind of public awareness that this had happened. These are not outliers. These are not examples of individuals gone bad, because when we frame the problem as simply individuals gone bad, we mask how the system was designed to function precisely as such. Right? The criminal justice system is an instrument of the state. It is itself not just a racial project, but a project that maintains racial ideology. It operates as a form of racism. And I'm bringing this up as a way to kind of tie it back with education, because the same can be said with education. So much of the rhetoric we hear about education is about blaming teachers or blaming students or blaming parents. But the reality is that education is also an instrument of the state, right? And it is also one that was designed to function with disparate outcomes. We talk about education as being all about equal educational opportunity, right? But the reality is that education was actually, as a system, was never designed to provide equal educational opportunity. The earliest public schools in this country were created for only the most elite. And as we were forced to integrate more and more, we just came up with more and more ways to differentiate and sort them, not only through exclusion, but through segregation, through tracking, through labeling, through discipline. The achievement gap is not necessarily a sign, therefore, that schools are failing. It's actually a sign that schools are succeeding. They're accomplishing exactly what they are set up to accomplish. And this happens not just through differential treatment, it happens also through curriculum. So again, almost 100 years ago, let's look at the wonderful work of people like Carter G. Woodson, who in his booklet, The Miseducation of the Negro, he argues that American education is teaching a particular racial ideology to groups of students. It's teaching white students to fit in at the top, Black students to fit in at the bottom. And his argument is, therefore, why in the world would we insist that Black students should get more of that education? The solution isn't simply more of a problematic education. The solution is a fundamentally different education. Right? And many students are aware that the system was never designed for them. So this takes me back to the research from about 50 years ago that I was mentioning earlier, right? That sometimes what we see is students resisting, recognizing on some level that the schools were never designed for them, or the design for them was not the same outcome that we often talk about. Right? This is the systemic problem that we need to be grappling with, not simply blaming individuals. A second way that we need to think about the problem is looking intersectionally. Are we connecting the dots? The United States was founded on slavery. Its identity is about slavery. Its economy is about slavery. The United States, however, was also founded on the stealing of land, the colonization, and the genocide of indigenous populations. It was founded on patriarchal ideologies. That's not only how we understand the distinction between the public and the private sector, it's also how we understand family, relationships, and in so many ways, how we talk about love itself. America was an imperialist project from the very beginning and continues to be so now. America has emerged with kind of neoliberalism as the operative ideology, not only when it comes to economy, but when it comes to so many other systems like education. My point is that all of these things need to be seen as intersecting. They intersect to both reinforce and be reinforced by anti-Blackness. And this is why I think it's some of the most exciting social movements today are intentionally intersectional. Right? Black Lives Matter is intentionally intersectional. Green New Deal is intentionally trying to connect the dots and be intersectional. So as we think about our role in trying to address any kind of endemic problem, are we connecting the dots? And this then brings us to education, because education, one of its roles is to connect the dots, right? So in the midst of coronavirus, but also in the midst of uprisings around anti-Blackness and the state, there are a lot of conversations, including webinars that I am aware of that focused on what individuals can do. And I think those are really important. Here are ways that we can teach. Here are ways that we can speak out. Here are ways that we can comfort those who are struggling with trauma and grief. But my point here is that we must go beyond what individuals can do. Right? Education is impoverished when it is approached individualistically. And so let me talk about two ways that we need to think beyond individualism. One is as educators and one is as institutions. Because as educators and or as scholars, we must do more collectively. Right? We've created a profession that centers on hyper-individualism. Right? I remember when I was learning to be a teacher, we often used to joke that, well, we can't wait till we have job security because then we can just close the door and do our brilliant things and not worry about all this kind of outside horrible interference, which is so true because there's so many horrible reforms going on and surveillance and things that limit our capacity to teach. But the reality is that our teaching is impoverished when we approach it hyper-individualistically. And this is one of the problems, not just in K-12, it's particularly germane in higher education. Right? It's particularly the case that higher education, the more you consider yourself an expert, the less likely you are to engage in teaching as a collective act. I used to say as a dean that it's hard for me to say that I can stand behind every single program. Why? Not because I've studied our programs and think they're problematic, but it's simply because you all are telling me that you rarely have conversations about what it is that you're teaching, right? We need to approach our work far more collectively. And in fact, sometimes I like to say that some of the biggest obstacles of moving towards equity and justice are not those who are explicit that they disagree. Sometimes the biggest obstacles are those who like to use the rhetoric of social justice a lot, but end up being some of the biggest obstacles to working collectively, right? How do we come together more? Work as a collective. This is, I think, one of the biggest questions. And so too with institutions. Institutions must do much more in solidarity. You know, in this moment like today, where we're seeing budgets being slashed, what is the tendency of institutions? It's actually to shrink. It's actually to say, as a way to spend less, we're going to do less and we're going to hire less. So we're letting people go and we're furloughing and we're shrinking programs and we're cutting courses and all of these things. Educational institutions, particularly higher education, has long been criticized as being disconnected, as being irrelevant, as being inconsequential. All we're doing is making ourselves even more disconnected, irrelevant, and inconsequential when we shrink down our capacity to act. This is a moment when educational institutions actually need to be stepping up and finding even more ways to act, right? Community schools is one great example of how communities rally around the school to expand what schools do beyond academic instruction. And I think this is part of what we need to be asking. What is the intervention of schools in this moment? I'm going to come back to that at the end of my presentation, but this is sort of the first chunk of reflections that I wanted to offer is what does it mean to be in solidarity? Well, it means that we look systemically. It means that we connect the dots. And it also means that we question what we think the very work of education is. The second thing I wanted to talk about, the other sort of big aspect of this moment that we're in is the coronavirus pandemic. So here I draw on one of my favorite writers and thinkers and organizers, Naomi Klein, who talks about what happened post-Katrina. So let's revisit this. So 2005 was Hurricane Katrina, destroyed the city of New Orleans. And what she tells us is that before the floodwaters had even receded, the Republican Study Committee in Congress gathered. This is kind of the conservative think tank in Congress. And or conservative kind of think caucus, right? It's a caucus within Congress, the Republican Study Committee. It was then chaired by Mike Pence. And what they did is they convened to ask, all right, well, so what is our response, right? How do we respond to New Orleans? And what they did is they put forward this proposal that said, here are the 32 ways that we can respond to Hurricane Katrina. And it was all about how we push forward, how we use this crisis to push forward on free market reforms. So some of those reforms had to do with education. And it's exactly what we saw. What are the two of the big outcomes that came from New Orleans? Well, one was Congress kind of ushered in for the first time federal level vouchers, right? You had within the Hurricane Relief Act, you saw federal vouchers, and then a few years later, Louisiana passed its own sort of state level voucher program. But you also saw the charterizing of schools, right? And this is what several years later, the Democratic Secretary of Education Arne Duncan would say that what is the best thing that happened to New Orleans public schools? Well, it was Katrina. Why? Because it allowed the state to kind of shut down the schools, take over, reopen most schools, almost every school as charter schools. And what was the result? Well, you actually saw increased racial segregation in those schools. You saw obviously increased privatization, and you also saw very mixed gains when it came to achievement and attainment in education. In other words, it did a lot more destruction than it did improvement in New Orleans. But the main thing that it did is it dismantled the public sector and it ushered in an era of privatization. So why does she bring this up? She brings this up because crisis can do exactly this, right? In a moment of crisis, you can advance more democratic ideals, or you can backpedal. You can fall back on the common sense of our times. And if the common sense of our times is that neoliberalism or that markets is going to solve everything, then that might be the direction that all reforms move in. And that's precisely what we're seeing in the midst of the coronavirus. So let me talk about sort of some of these things that are happening, right? Just like in New Orleans, when it comes to education, there are two things that helps us to understand what's opening the doors for all kinds of really bad things happening. One is the shuttering of schools, and two is a massive amount of federal funding, right? And so that's what we saw in New Orleans, but that's even far more what we're seeing right now at the kind of nationwide level. So there are several trends that I wanted to point to that we should be mindful of and ready to address. And one is the divestment from the public sector. In other words, so this is what we're seeing all over the place, right? Is that as we face this crisis, particularly that's at the state and local level, as you see less tax revenue come in, governments are slashing, and the federal government is not stepping up. It's the same thing we saw in 2008 in the beginning of the Great Recession. The federal government failed to buffer the states and local governments, right, from the massively declining revenue. And then what you saw is that budgets were cut in all sorts of institutions, including in education. And we never actually made up that cut. And so the funding level of education actually hasn't even come back up to where it was in 2008. And then the coronavirus comes around in 2019, 2020, and we see, again, massive cuts. And what is being proposed, the $100 billion in the sort of round 4 of the stimulus package for the federal government that's supposed to target states and locals, that's maybe 1/5, 1/6 of what some are projecting is actually needed to kind of maintain where we were. So even what people are saying is like far too socialist, it's far falling short. The reality is that what some are saying is too socialist and too much. I think many would say is far short of what states and locals need, right? So what did we see in April? We saw job losses of almost 500,000 K-12 educators, right? And May is probably worse, and that might just trickle. That might just steamroll as time goes on, right? The public sector is being slammed in this moment. We're weakening our capacity to educate. And for many, that's probably not a bad thing. Why? Because for many, privatization is the goal. So let's look at the second major trend, which is the profiteering by the private sector. So already what we're seeing are vouchers, right? So Betsy DeVos wants to do these things called microgrants, which are actually vouchers. We also saw massive amounts of money going to charter schools that she either personally handed or that the charter school organizations were telling charter schools, apply for small business funding, right? So lots of money, hundreds of millions already we can account for are moving into the charter sector. But who's probably going to be the biggest winner, or maybe already is? It's the tech sector, right? Because so much of the money, already well over 13 billion that's being allocated to education, possibly 100 billion more, where can we expect a lot of that money to go? Well, probably to the tech sector, because what are we doing when we shutter schools? We rely on online platforms to deliver instruction, right? Why is this important to name? Because this is actually a kind of a dream of many in the tech world. I think about not just individuals and tech companies. I think about organizations like Amplify, right? So Amplify is one of these kind of advocacy organizations that has been trying to push for the technologization of education for years. And it echoes the words of people like Warren Buffett, people like Laureen Jobs, the widow of Steve Jobs, right? These kind of tech giants, multi-billionaires, who are saying not just that education will benefit from technology, but it's also saying that education, which we know is over $500 billion domestic enterprise, there's enormous profits to be made if you were to succeed in privatizing. This is like the perfect storm, right? Of schools shuttering, massive amounts of federal funding, and over-reliance on technology. This is like the perfect moment to then try to profiteer off of this. The reliance on remote learning opens the door to expanding the permanent funding for alternatives to traditional public schools, right? So in other words, it isn't just a momentary profiteering. What this does is set the stage for a kind of a permanent shift in how we think about education. What are we seeing pushes for? Online charters, online resources for homeschooling, and online competency-based certifiers. Okay? What's a third trend? It's to exacerbate existing inequities, especially regarding technology. So technology, of course, we know can enhance education. The problem is that what we tend to do in a moment of crisis, like what we saw, we had like overnight, we shut schools. We said, teachers, come up with something to do in your classrooms. And so what we didn't do was provide either the platforms or the professional development or other kinds of resources to think about what is the value added of technology. So instead, what we tended to see over and over again, lots of social media, right? People complaining about the use of technology. Well, what we were seeing was people talking about how technology was actually amplifying some of the worst aspects of in-person education, right? It was kind of zeroing in on the most simplistic ways of thinking about education. So let's think about some of the examples, right? Education at its most simplistic can be about content delivery and then practice. Right? That's often how we think about classes, right? What do you do when you're with your students? You deliver content. And then what do you do as homework? You have them practice it. Super simplistic, highly problematic, but it's a trend. It's sort of a norm, right? It's very pervasive in terms of how we think about education. And that is what we were seeing with this sort of reliance on online technology, right? Is that we are so focused on content delivery and practice. Okay. Actually, I don't want to jump around too much, but I do want to kind of highlight how, what does the research tell us though, is some of the most important things that students need to learn that will have measurable kind of positive life outcomes. Is it academic skills? Well, actually, there's a lot of research that says that if all you do is zero in on academic skills, you impoverish students. You actually weaken their capacity to thrive in the future. Why? Because equally important, if not more, are the so-called soft skills. Right? So what we did at soft skills are things like work habits, social skills, conscientiousness, things like that, right? So what we did is we zeroed in on the academic skills because we thought that was the bottom line and we thought that was what was going to keep achievement up. And what we should have actually done is say, how about we not focus on the narrow aspects of education that we all can kind of agree is problematic anyway? How about we actually say, in this moment of trauma, what do students and young people most need, right? I'm not the only one who says this, right? In a moment of trauma, probably one of the worst things you could do is put heightened pressure to stay on pace. And so everyone's talking about staying on pace and not falling behind. And all that does is zeroes in on academic skills. It narrows how we think about instruction. It heightens the sort of pressure to accomplish something that maybe we never were meant to sort of accomplish in the first place, right? What if we were to actually say that there's different ways to use this time when we're in a moment of crisis? So sort of side note, right? That's really what we should have been doing with young people. But anyway, let me return to my presentation, that we are also exacerbating inequities, especially regarding technology, with this trend. So let me name some of the existing inequities that are being exacerbated. There's inequities between schools, between homes, and between individuals. So between schools, schools have different levels of resources that they can provide their students, right? That gets exacerbated if you rely on technology. But so is between homes. Some students don't have homes. Some students are at homes and there's no quiet space to study, or they're looking after their siblings, or there's all kinds of other problems going on, violence and so on, right? And then there's inequities between the capacities of individuals. We know that not every student has the capacity to suddenly now spend all their time on the computer. So if you suddenly say, okay, we're going to do everything on the computer, and you provide no tech support, obviously that's going to impact and be exacerbated by the reliance on technology. In the first few weeks, Los Angeles School District alone reported that tens of thousands of students were either irregularly checking in or hadn't even checked in, right? And this why? Perhaps because of the home, perhaps because of capacity of student, right? There's all sorts of reasons. There's also inequities between the capacities of teachers to teach online, and there's also inequities in the capacities of caregivers to support students who now are relying on caregivers to do a lot of the teaching, okay? We also have inequities, we also have injustices when it comes to technology. In other words, not just inequities and differences, but injustices that relate to the over-reliance on technology. Let me name a few. One is that many people cannot use technology, right? Or don't benefit in the same way. I think about very, very young children, which is why some elementaries or schools are saying, hey, maybe we should open up schools for, if we're gonna phase in, maybe we start with the really earliest, because it's really hard for me to teach a 5-year-old on a computer all day. But it's also students with disabilities. And why do I bring this up? Because some of you are probably aware that some of the advocacy organizations were pushing for all kinds of waivers of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. They're saying, well, students with disabilities cannot benefit in the same way as sort of mainstream students. And so maybe during these months of education, we need to be waived from IDEA requirements, right? One of the worst possible things that we could be saying, right, is to give up on students with disabilities. But let's not be surprised that that was a huge push, not only by advocacy groups, but by Congress members themselves. What are some other injustice issues? Data privacy. Are some of you aware that the platforms that we use are owned by companies like Amazon that share their data with like federal entities like ICE, right? We should be very aware of what students are putting on, right? And how that putting onto the platforms and how that then gets shared. We know that there's online bullying and sexual exploitation happening online. We know that also extensive screen time correlates with negative impacts on literacy development, math development, mental health, and physical health, right? We also know that when students miss a significant amount of school time, it impacts school achievement, like test scores and grades. It impacts school attainment, like graduation rates and post-secondary education, right? And this might be therefore also further widened if you have inequitable access to technology. So all of this is to say, right, that the reliance on technology, it's driving all sorts of, all of these other problems, right? And yet this is actually a push by tech organizations, by sort of profiteers, and by some of the billionaires. And just as a side note, some of us have put together the statement. Over 600 educators of color have signed. If you are a person of color and you are interested in signing the statement, go to my website. It's a statement about how billionaires are pushing really problematic market-based reforms onto sort of poorer communities of color, right? And it sort of resembles a lot of the things that we're talking about here, about reforms that actually make learning worse and reforms that are highly profitable. And then finally, what I wanted to say is, let's all tie this back to education, is that this is therefore a moment for us to think about the role of education, for us to insist that education cannot contribute as usual, right? Because after all, what I think this highlights is that education as usual is the problem, is contributing, right? Is sort of helping us to brought us to sort of where we are in this first place. Part of what I wanted to say is that our recognition isn't what are a few things we can do differently to make education about inequity, right? As Dr. Keefe pointed out at the beginning of this presentation, schools were not set up for everyone and so they sort of perpetuate legacies of injustice. Our job isn't to add a few good things to education. Our job is to radically rethink what education can be, right? And what education can do and what our role is in that. So in my final minutes, let me just sort of point to some examples of this. I already said that in a moment of crisis, the tendency of institutions is to step back. Our job is to actually therefore demand that we not do that. We should actually be seeing protests, and this will make me a super controversial thing. Is this really going to be recorded and posted? I'm just kidding. Let's say something really controversial, which is that there should be huge amounts of organizing, pushing, uprising that insists that education must step up in this moment. We must look differently and have a very different impact in the world. What are some examples? In a moment of uprisings around anti-Blackness and white supremacy, how dare education continue to be so silent on issues of race? Anti-racist education should be a centerpiece of how we think about what it is that we teach. In a moment with levels of unemployment that we have not seen since the peak of the Great Depression, and by the way, while some leaders want to claim that unemployment levels came down, which it did overall, do we also recognize that there were certain groups for which unemployment continued to increase in this month when unemployment came down for most people? And who were some of those groups? It was Asians and it was Blacks, right? So Black people are still, right, being highly impacted negatively by what's going on. Let's not celebrate. This is not a time to celebrate. This is actually a time to say things continue to get worse. What is our role when so many are homeless, when so many are food insecure? I'm working with a lot of higher ed institutions, and I'm saying some ed institutions have opened up their dorms. Some ed institutions have opened up their cafeterias, right? Why are we not doing more of it? How many thousands of buildings are sitting unused right now that could be providing all sorts of services to support those most disenfranchised and suffering? Right? This is a moment when we should be also rethinking what it is that we do in education, right? Why do we still allow corporations, why do we still allow ourselves to be governed by corporate boards, right? How embarrassing. Like, we should be saying, no, that is absolutely not what education should look like. But by the way, let's also flag something. We have a lot of public entities that are governed by elected boards. Elected boards aren't necessarily the answer either, because elected boards are often stepping stones for other political sort of offices. And elected boards without education are relying on commonsensical narratives about what we should be doing, right? There are many who argue that elections sort of are not democratic, and they're certainly not just oriented if elections don't coincide with critical public education. You cannot rely on the public to govern if the public has not been critically educated, right? So democracy hinges on the ability of education to reach the general public. That's how governance can be more democratic, right? And that's what we should be insisting when it comes to the governing of our institutions. So whether we think about curriculum, whether we think about facilities, whether we think about governance, whether we think about even community relations, our entities should all be looking like community schools. They should all be owned by communities. They should all be serving communities, not stepping back in a moment when we most need these institutions. Education, final point, education must be more in line with social movements. This is sort of what I'm trying to say. Everything I have just said is all about how education must be seen as part of social movements. Instead, what we do is we treat education like institutions. We treat education like corporations. We, in other words, impoverish the ability of education to function in the service of social movements with these commonsensical frameworks of how we think about the very work of education, right? And this goes back to why we cannot simply tinker with the inner workings. What we actually need to do is reframe what we think education should be about. And we need to do everything we can to build towards that movement. So these are some of the challenges and questions and opportunities that I urge us to grapple with as we engage in this important work. And I hope that this presentation helps in that effort. Let me turn it back to Dr. Keefe, and thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this webinar.
Thank you so much. That was incredibly inspiring, and as usual, just I was hanging on your words, and honestly, at one point, I was leaning so far into my screen that I noticed that my face was like right up in the camera, so I apologize to everyone that had to see that. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your thinking, and I think that, you know, it is so clear from what Dr. Kumashiro just said, that how he helps people to make sense of these very complex things, and you are certainly an inspiration. And I really encourage everyone to run to his website and check out all of his other amazing work. So thank you so much. We have a couple of questions, and I'm going to read them to you. The first question was, you referenced hyper-individualistic teaching, and could you say a little bit about what that is?
Yes, thank you. I was trying so hard to like not lose my place on my outline. I did see that question pop up and I was like, oh, I need to come back to that. Hyper-individualized. So what I mean by that is there's so many ways in which we silo ourselves. And this happens in a number of different levels. It happens with how we think about programs and departments, right? In so many schools and colleges, we hear people talking about everyone's so siloed. Well, this is one example of being super hyper individualized, right? We're not all kind of collaborating and working across programs. But even in the classroom, I mean that it should be, sorry, let me just shut that off. Even in the classroom, I feel like we're very hyper individualized in how we approach our teaching, that every teacher is sort of on their own, right? And many schools I know are brilliantly thinking differently and structuring teaching differently. And teachers are themselves finding ways to work with one another. But the reality is that we've created professions and institutions where you actually have to go against the norm in order to collaborate with one another. So some examples, one example that I'd like to give in higher education especially, but actually even when I was a K-12 teacher, this was definitely the case. I rarely talked about what I was doing. And we rarely talk, I think, about what we do in our classrooms. We don't kind of hash through the syllabi that we design. We think that because you're an expert, you should be able to design a brilliant syllabus. So go to it. And that's all we do. And then we say, great job, you got some good evals. But what we don't do is think and talk all the time about our teaching, about our syllabi, about the struggles we have in our classrooms, about our assignments. And this is why I think it's hard. It's hard for me to believe that a program can stand behind every single class if the teachers in that program or department haven't all hashed through what every single class is doing. So whether it's about our classroom teaching or it's about the program and the larger curriculum, how do we approach that collectively? I don't mean team teaching. I mean collectively coming together to hash through our teaching. That's sort of some of what I was thinking about when I think about hyper-individualism.
Thank you. The next question was, and you did address this, can you say a little bit about the effects of privatization on students with disabilities and English learners?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the question is broadly about privatization, but I think particularly with the coronavirus, when it comes to students with disabilities, I think one of the really big problems that we're struggling with is that with the move towards technology, there's a lot of people who are pushing for IDEA waivers. And of course that connects with privatization because the move towards technology is very much about sort of profiteering off of this moment. But what I would say is happening more broadly, maybe just to jump around a little bit, I think what's happening broadly in education is that as we sort of dismantle the public sector, what we do is we rely on more and more private entities to offer education. right? Sort of privately managed charter schools, or even vouchers into charter schools, online charter schools, all of these sorts of things. What happens when we do that is we step away from our responsibility to educate all. Right? So as you dismantle the public sector and you rely more and more on privates just doing out of the goodness of their own hearts, serving everyone, what do we see is that students most marginalized get left behind, because charters, private schools, religious institutions, do they have to serve any student with disability that comes to them? Do they have to serve English language learners? I mean, the laws and the court cases like Lau versus Nichols, Bilingual Education Act, IDEA, they were all about insisting that the system must find ways to serve. And when you dismantle the system, you no longer have that imperative, right? So privatization, you can imagine, is going to be less well, it's less demanded, but it's also less incentivized to serve students with the highest needs, because they are sometimes the most expensive to serve because of the additional sort of support needed, right? So in so many ways, I think with the current crisis, but also with sort of the general trend to dismantle the public sector, privatization is opening the doors widely to abandon those who are most marginalized.
That was amazing, as usual. I think that is the last question that we have time for. You seem to, I think you addressed some of the other questions that came in, but we are giving away 3 of your books. So I'd like to share my screen to do that right now. So 3 lucky people are going to get Dr. Kumashiro's books, and I'm going to share my screen. I also, before I do that, want to thank, with great thanks to all of the people over this webinar series that contributed, including the brilliant Dr. Kevin Kumashiro, but every single person on this slide contributed and helped this effort, including all of you who shared your thoughts and your ideas and the ways that you use the work that we did together over the past few months in your own work. So as you're winding down your school years, I wish you the best, and I hope you get some rest as well. Okay, so here, as usual, we are going to the wheel of names. We've lost some people, so I hope that we will be able to, there's so many of you that the names don't all show up, but I hope that we will be able to give these books away to 3 people who are here. So please email me at stringerkeefe@stonehill.edu, and I will get your address and we will send you Dr. Kumashiro's amazing books. For those of you that don't win, tech probs, come on, wheel. David Ortiz, that is very remarkable. David Ortiz, I don't know. If David does not email me, I will email out the winner of another book that we do, because I'm not sure if David is actually here. Okay, we'll remove him and we'll spin one more time. And we have Sonia Lanehart. Congratulations to all of the winners. That's amazing. And I'm going to go back here and just tell you about what's going to be happening in July. So inspired really by last week's webinar with Dr. Elizabeth Kenny Cox, who joined me to talk about disrupting the literacy curriculum, and this week's embracing anti-oppressive education with Dr. Kumashiro, I am putting together a 3-part series over the summer, July 9th, 16th, and 23rd, 7 to 8 p.m., called Teaching Toward Justice, Realizing Diversity, Equity, and Inclusivity in Our Schools. Very excited about the developing list of guests that will join me for those webinars. It's a little too premature to announce them, but I'm excited about the possibilities. And here is the description for all of you who might be interested in what we're going to be talking about this summer. And again, as a way to help educators be thinking about how to change their own practice and how to be influencing schools as spaces of inclusive environments and communities. And thank you to the brilliant Dr. Kevin Kumashiro for being here. I'm so very thrilled to have had you join me. And as usual, I learned so much from you today that I hope to enact in my own practice going forward. And to all of you who are winding down your own practice as your school years, take moments to get breaks and go outside and stay away from the computer and get some sun and fresh air, and hopefully we'll return in a very rejuvenated and renewed sense to start unpacking some of these systemic oppressions and becoming educator activists in our own right. So I hope you'll all join me in July, and I look forward to seeing you in the future.